Dear students, this is The History and Culture of the Indian People, published by Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, Mumbai. Chief Editor Professor R.C. Majumdar. Volume 1, The Vedic Age.
Chapter 1. Indian History, Its Nature, Scope, and Method. History has been defined as the study of man's dealings with other men and the adjustment of working relations between human groups. The beginnings of the history of India, therefore, go back to that remote period when man first settled in this country. We need not discuss whether he migrated from outside or emerged here by a process of evolution from his animal ancestors. But in any case, the earliest man has left little evidence to enable us to investigate his thoughts, desires, activities, or achievements. We can only dimly discern his gradual growth as a sentient being amid the geological changes and physical and biological environment in which he found himself. To begin with, he was essentially a part of the plant and animal life that surrounded him, reacting passively to the climate and geographical configuration of the land. But he slowly gained consciousness of those powers and potentialities which distinguished him from other animals and enabled him to dominate over nature rather than remain its slave. The greater part of this process of evolution, which must have covered a long period of time, is only a matter of inference based on very slender evidence. The study of this fascinating subject has made some progress in Europe, while so far as India is concerned, it is still in its infancy. But the little that is known shows that the prehistoric period in India presents features very similar to what we meet with in Western Asia and Europe. Here, as elsewhere, man's prehistory merges in the pageant of the animal world and is largely determined by his natural surroundings. This volume, therefore, begins with a short account of the geological, geographical, and biological background of primitive man. This setting of the stage is followed by a study of the peoples who played their part therein. In the absence of any written record, the little that we know of their history and culture is based on archaeological finds, such as tools and implements made of stone, bone, or metal, potsherds, rude paintings, and skeletal remains, exactly the same type of evidence on which the prehistoric study of other countries is based. As we proceed with our narrative, we gradually realize that the different phases of Indian history present a striking parallel to those of other countries, which can boast of a culture and civilization going back to remote antiquity. The stone implements and other remains of the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods prove that human civilization began here in the same way, if not at the same time, as in other parts of the world. The development of this civilization through the Copper and Iron Ages presents features which, though not identical, yet offer sufficient similarity in detail with what we know of many other countries. The discoveries in the Indus Valley and adjacent regions have further emphasized the close association between the cultures of India and those of Western Asia, and thereby link up Indian history with that of the most ancient period of the world known to us. India now takes her place side by side with Egypt and Mesopotamia as a country where we can trace the dawn of human civilization and the beginnings of those thoughts, ideas, activities, and movements which have shaped the destinies of mankind all over the civilized world. The history of India thus possesses an aspect of universality which so strikingly distinguishes the history of Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria in the early, and Persia, Greece, and Rome in a somewhat later age. In the case of each of these, the universal aspect far transcends in importance the individual or regional aspect. This is not, however, the case with India. This difference has modified the outlook and treatment of the history of India and made it a problem almost sui generis. The chief difference between India and the other ancient countries mentioned above lies in the continuity of her history and civilization. The culture and civilization of Egypt, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and Persia have long ceased to exist. They are now mere past memories, and their history possesses only an academic interest. Indian history and institutions, however, form an unbroken chain, by which the past is indissolubly linked up with the present. The modern peoples of Egypt and Mesopotamia have no bond whatsoever with the civilization that flourished there millennia ago, and its memorials have no more, usually very, very much less, meaning to them than to any enlightened man in any part of the world. But not so in India. The icons discovered at Mohenjo-daro are those of gods and goddesses who are still worshipped in India, and Hindus from the Himalaya to Cape Comorin repeat even today the Vedic hymns which were uttered on the banks of the Indus nearly 4,000 years ago. This continuity in language and literature and in religious and social usages is more prominent in India than even in Greece and Italy, where we can trace the same continuity in history. The social and religious ideas of ancient Greece and Rome, and their philosophy and outlook on life, in short, some of the most essential factors which give individuality to a nation and preserve its continuity, are almost foreign to the peoples now inhabiting those lands. An artificial continuity is no doubt maintained in these two countries, and the link with the past is not altogether snapped, as in the cases of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Nevertheless, the difference can only be regarded as one of degree and not of kind, and neither Greece nor Italy offers a parallel to India in respect of either antiquity or continuity of civilization. To this difference may be added the present position of India. Her political subjection and lack of material power have relegated her to a position of marked inferiority in the eyes of the world. Both these causes have affected the study of the history of India in more ways than one. It has not been easy, for instance, to bring a detached scientific spirit to bear on the study of the history of India. This spirit, which so conspicuously distinguishes European writers of the history of Egypt and ancient countries in Western Asia, is not seldom lamentably absent while they deal with the history of India. The reason is not far to seek and may be traced to a psychological instinct or political prejudice. The India of today has cast its shadow on the past, and few writers have been able to disentangle the two and view each of them in its true perspective. The political history of India, even of ancient times, has been almost invariably viewed through the spectacles of the 18th and 19th centuries. V.A. Smith, the well-known historian of ancient India and a distinguished member of the Indian Civil Service, never concealed his anxiety to prove the beneficence of the British Raj by holding before his readers the picture of anarchy and confusion, which in his view has been the normal condition in India with rare intervals. To him, as to many others before and after him, ancient Indian history after the death of Harsha Vardhana was merely a pathetic tale of political chaos and internecine struggles, pointing to the inevitable moral. Such was India, and such it always has been, till the British established a stable order. Sometimes the pendulum swings to the opposite extreme, and Indian writers seek to find in ancient India a replica of the most advanced political institutions of the West. From isolated phrases of doubtful import, they conjure up a picture of a full-fledged modern democracy, and even of an up-to-date parliamentary form of government. This is a counterblast from the Indian side to the inveterate belief of European writers in undiluted autocracy as the only form of government that ever prevailed in India. To them, Oriental despotism is an article of faith that colors their whole outlook. Some have also inherited the classical idea that wisdom and enlightenment were always a sort of monopoly of the West, and the East, comparatively as backward as she is today, must have acquired all the elements of higher culture from the West. The squalid poverty of modern India colors the outlook on economic conditions in ancient and medieval times. Even enlightened historians find it difficult to accept the view that Indians built ships and navigated the seas, for no better reason than that modern Indians show such an aversion from and ineptitude for maritime activities. Such instances may be multiplied to almost any extent. There are no doubt exceptions, but one cannot deny or overlook the broad fact that Indian history has suffered much from an instinct to read the present into the past. The opposite danger of reading the past into the present has been no less a potential factor in distorting the history of India. to many the most glaring imperfections and even the most degrading features of modern Indian social life are sanctified by antiquity. They have a tendency to judge everything they see before them, not by its present form and effect, but by a reference to what they conceive to be its original character, and the part it is supposed to have played in building up an ideal society in the past. This almost necessarily leads to the artificial creation of a golden age which rests mainly on imagination and intuition, independent of historical evidence. This intellectual support of false doctrines and bad institutions in the name of India's past often proceeds from a perverted form of patriotic sentiments or an inborn sense of national pride. In either case, it is a wrong interpretation of Indian history, and what is worse, such interpretation is often devised as an instrument for consecrating all deep-seated prejudices. The student of Indian history must avoid these pitfalls and follow the modern method of scientific research. Our aim should be the discovery of the truth, and nothing but the truth. And in order to attain this goal, we must apply our minds fearlessly and without prejudice and preconceptions to the study of all available evidence. We should properly sift these data by all rational methods, handle them in the spirit of a judge rather than an advocate, and formulate our conclusions only as far as they permit us to do so. We may not achieve definite results in many cases, and final and decisive conclusions would probably be few and far between. But it is better to plead ignorance, express doubts, and put forward alternative possibilities, rather than definitely uphold a view on meager and insufficient grounds. We must be particularly on our guard, where any such view is likely to evoke strong sentiments and passions, or affect the interest of any class or community. The history of India's past touches the present life of India on many points, and we may legitimately expect the one to guide and control the other. This makes it all the more difficult, especially for an Indian writer, to take a detached view of the history of India and approach it in a purely scientific attitude. Nevertheless, the difficulty, great as it is, must be overcome, and a proper critical spirit should be cultivated if we are to read aright the story of India's past and correctly understand its implications for the future. We have so far dealt with the peculiar difficulties that confront us in the study of Indian history in view of its continuity. Another obstacle, also of a somewhat special character, arises from the nature of the evidence on which the study must necessarily be based. The different classes of evidence and their nature, scope, and value will be discussed in detail in the next chapter. But some general points must be noted here in order to indicate both the limitations and the specific directions of our study. The first thing to remember is that for the longest period of Indian history, from the earliest time down to the Muslim conquest in the 13th century AD, a period of about 4,000 years, we possess no historical text of any kind, much less such a detailed narrative as we possess in the case of Greece, Rome, and China. The history of ancient India resembles, therefore, that of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. In all these cases, it has only been possible to reconstruct the skeleton with the help of archaeological evidence discovered in comparatively recent times. This history differs radically from what we normally understand by the word. It is mostly a string of names and incidents, often with wide gaps, and almost always without that fullness of detail which enables us to trace the causes and consequences of specific events, examine the various forces at work in their true perspective, mark the general tendencies of the epoch, explain the inner causes of the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires, or the progress and decay of races and nations, and determine the exact relation between the different elements of the body politic or the different aspects of life and society. These and many other features which make history a social science, in the real sense of the term, are lacking in the history of ancient India, more or less to the same extent as in that of other ancient civilizations that flourished in Egypt or Western Asia. But there is one very important difference. Ancient India has bequeathed to us a vast treasury of texts which represent the intellectual and literary activities of more than 2,000 years and cover a wide field. The earliest literary work, the Samhita of the Rigveda, is at least 3,000 years old and may be even considerably older. A continuous stream of literature flowing since that remote age, widening in course of centuries, and embracing almost all fields of human endeavor, excepting political activity, throws a light on the civilization of India such as we do not meet with in cases of other ancient cultures. This mass of literature deals with philosophy and religion, including ethics, ritual and ceremonial, cosmogony, cosmology, geography, astronomy, and the allied sciences, political and economic doctrines and practices, and, in a minor way, with almost all branches of secular life. It includes, besides a mass of religious texts, purely literary works such as epics, lyrics, kavais, poems, dramas, and prose romances, as well as biographies and folk tales. This literature is as bulky in volume as it is varied in its contents, although it does not help us very much in reconstructing the political history of ancient India. It throws a flood of light on and enables us to trace the various stages in the development of culture and civilization in ancient India, such as is not possible in the case of ancient Egypt, Western Asia and China, and even Greece and Rome. This fact must be borne in mind in any approach to the study of ancient Indian history. We should not expect any critical and detailed narrative of the political events or a proper estimate of the life and character of great historical personages of whom we catch but fleeting glimpses in the moving panorama of the history of 2,000 years that passes before our eyes in a haze of mist or gloom. The galaxy of kings, generals, and statesmen which crowd, for instance, the canvas of the history of Greece and Rome, the moving stories of their lives and activities, the surging mass of internal and external forces that shape the destiny of the state and set it going, sometimes in slow evolution and sometimes in revolutionary ardor, and the ebb and tide of national glory from age to age with its intense human appeal and great lessons for posterity. All these and many other factors which form the spell of the history of Greece and Rome do not constitute the main force or the chief interest of ancient Indian history. That these elements were not lacking in the evolution of Indian history is proved by the occasional glimpses of great men and great events of the same genre. But these are mostly shadows, without that glow and color which endow them with life and spirit. Hence the picture is dull and lifeless, and, being devoid of general interest, makes no passionate appeal to human mind. But though admittedly deficient in this respect, Indian history is abundantly rich in its delineation of the progress of the human mind and society from its earliest infancy to a comparatively mature state. Other civilizations must have passed through the same or similar stages, but we lack the means to trace them in such fullness of details. In no other case, for example, can we go back to the dim beginnings of those intellectual and moral ideas which appear to us in full maturity in the shape of a set form of religion, theology, and philosophy. Thanks to the vast mass of Indian literature, we can not only do this, but follow in a general way the long and tortuous ways which human civilization, at least in a large part of the world, has had to pursue in its weary and tedious onward march for thousands of years. This constitutes a claim for universal interest which should not be less keen than that inspired by the political history of Greece and Rome. The genius of each considerable group of humanity is perhaps adapted more to one kind of end than to another. It has been argued that the Indians had a bent of mind which looked more to the inner self than the outer body, to matters spiritual rather than the material world. In the absence of a fuller knowledge of the political history or secular life of ancient India, it is difficult to set the final seal of approval to this view, although it is very generally held. But so far as available evidence goes, there cannot be the slightest doubt that Indian civilization manifests itself in a way and a form very different from that with which we are familiar in the rest of the world. We have consequently to approach the history of India in a different spirit and adopt a different scale of values in order to appraise her culture and civilization. The wars and conquests, the rise and fall of empires and nations, and the development of political ideas and institutions should not be regarded as the principal object of our study and must be relegated to a position of secondary importance. On the other hand, more stress should be laid upon philosophy, religion, art, and letters, the development of social and moral ideas, and the general progress of those humanitarian ideals and institutions which form the distinctive feature of the spiritual life of India and her greatest contribution to the civilization of the world. Nevertheless, the political history of each period, as far as it is known to us, must be the starting point of our study, as it forms the backbone of history. Its function may be compared to that of the skeleton in a human body, which gives shape and distinctness to the mass of flesh and skin and marks it with the stamp of individuality. The greatest handicap in the treatment of the history of ancient India, both political and cultural, is the absence of a definite chronology. The dates of political events and of the vast mass of literature, which forms the basis of cultural study, are but imperfectly known, and the farther back we recede, even a close approximation of these dates becomes more and more difficult and uncertain. This gives scope for endless discussions and wide differences of opinion. We experience a similar difficulty in the interpretation of data, as they are often vague and meager. It is not always possible, and in many cases neither desirable nor profitable, in a general comprehensive history of India, to review the different standpoints, and the historian is often obliged to adopt one particular view as against others, with or sometimes even without brief reference to them. For minute discussions of the merits of conflicting views, the reader must be referred to special treatises or articles in journals. Great care should, however, always be taken to distinguish clearly the known from the unknown, and the doubtful from the certain, and to indicate, as far as possible, the range of our ignorance and uncertainty. Ignorance may not be bliss in historical studies, but it is certainly folly to be wise where wisdom is based on imperfect knowledge and serves merely as a cloak for dogmatism. As the following pages will show, the path of the historian is beset with difficulties, doubts, and uncertainties. He has often to advance laboriously through dubious tracks, and not seldom loses them altogether. His task frequently resolves itself into weighing one set of doubtful evidence against another, in order to arrive at what appears to him to be the most reasonable conclusion. More often than not, such theories are all that he can offer. The historian, no less than his readers, must clearly recognize the provisional nature of these hypotheses and be ready to see them modified or upset and replaced by others with the discovery of fresh data. They are slender but necessary foundations on which the history of India has been built up in the past and has to be built in future. The observations hitherto made apply more particularly to the ancient period of Indian history. With the beginning of the next period, the situation is considerably improved by the existence of a series of chronicles dealing with the history of India from the foundation of the political power by foreign Muslim invaders up to the 18th century AD. These chronicles include detailed narratives of contemporary events as well as compilations of past history from older sources now lost to us. They cannot be regarded as an absolutely authentic account or impartial review of historical events, but supply ample data for the reconstruction of the history of the period. Both in scope and value, they are comparable to the chronicles and historical treatises in Europe of the same period. Unfortunately, these historical texts concern themselves primarily with the events and fortunes of the principal Muslim ruling dynasties, and dwell only very incidentally on the history of the smaller states, especially the Hindu kingdoms, nor, with a few exceptions, do they throw much light on the life of the people at large outside the royal courts. Although therefore there is a great advance in our historical knowledge over the earlier period, and in some cases we have got a pretty good historical account, it is, generally speaking, neither as definite nor as full as our modern historical sense would demand, in spite of the valuable additional help that the historian gets from other sources such as the archaeological evidence, official documents, contemporary literature, accounts of foreign travelers, etc. Nevertheless, it would be unjust to deny that from about 1200 AD India possesses a written history which would not suffer very much in comparison with the history of contemporary Europe, and might differ from it in degree, but not in kind. It is a fairly good and detailed history, but of kings and states, not of the country and the people. The 13th century AD may be regarded as a broad dividing line in Indian history in more than one sense. The sovereign power passed into the hands of foreigners who belonged to alien races and professed a new religion of somewhat militant type. The establishment for the first time of two diverse systems of culture and civilization led to a definite cleavage between the rulers and the ruled, such as India had never known before. Indian history gains in content and becomes richer in detail, but loses unity of treatment. The stories of the ruling powers grow in volume, but we know little of the lot of the ruled, who formed the vast mass of the people. The first 3 or 4 centuries of Muslim rule in India form a very important period of transition. The foreign rulers and the new religion with its exotic culture took a long time to take root in the soil, but we have little reliable knowledge of the struggle for independence and the steps by which the resistance of the people was broken down, of the early reaction of Hinduism towards Islam, and the process by which the latter gradually made headway in this land of conservatism and orthodoxy. We know even less. The Muslim chroniclers, our sole source of information generally speaking, record only a series of cheap military victories over the rebellious or recalcitrant infidels, and these are looked down upon as merely hewers of wood and drawers of water, whose life and fortunes are hardly of any consequence to them. They would have us believe that the triumphant banner of Islam merrily floated from one end of the land to the other, and nothing else counted in the country. But this is merely one side of the picture, and that of the lion painted by himself. We know that there was always a Hindu India, side by side with Muslim India, and it again asserted itself both in politics and culture in the fullness of time. It was not dead, but lay dormant in the early centuries of the foreign rule. The history of the Hindus, except in South India and Rajputana, during this period is, however, almost a blank page. The scanty remains of their literature throw some faint light on the social and religious changes that came over them, but the little that we know merely casts into greater relief the depth of our ignorance. Light dawns again in the 16th century. The establishment of the Mughal power ushers in a new period of Indian history, in which our knowledge of India as a whole is much fuller, and we begin to see things in their true perspective. The vision of a new India, built upon the only stable foundation of the love and confidence of the ruled and the fusion of the two great cultures, now emerges in clear light. History, though it still continues mainly to be the court history of the Muslim rulers, begins to visualize India as a whole and takes note of Hindu India. The rosy dream of a politically united India on a common cultural basis is soon shattered, but Hindu India comes to stay and the historian no longer loses sight of it. The balance is restored and the unity of Indian history is securely established. In spite of many vicissitudes, we can trace the fortunes of India as a whole through the pages of history. This unity of treatment is never lost in later times. It is not necessary to dwell at length upon the modern history of India. Strictly speaking, it offers no peculiarities in respect of sources of information or method of treatment, save and except the restrictions imposed by political considerations. The archives of the British government are gradually being thrown open, and the Indian states also have recently adopted a more liberal policy in this respect. Contemporary historical documents are ample, though they have not yet been worked out as fully or as independently as one could have desired. It will be hardly any exaggeration to say that Indian history, in a comprehensive sense, has so far been neither written nor even conceived in a proper spirit. A clear grasp of the subject is generally lacking. An attempt has been made above to analyze the different factors that account for this lamentable state of things. We have also tried to indicate the true spirit in which the study of Indian history should be approached, the inherent defects and shortcomings imposed by lack of materials, and the likely dangers and pitfalls which the historian should avoid. The observations made above would also convey some idea of what the history of India means to its readers, what they might legitimately look for, and what they are likely to miss. the proper value they should attach to different aspects, and the profit they may derive from them. The resemblances as well as the differences which it offers to the history of other countries. And lastly, the extent to which the interest of the subject is confined to the particular region and people of whom it treats or concerns a wider range of humanity. Dear students, this was the Chapter 1, Indian History, Nature, Scope, and Method from the book History and Culture of Indian People, Volume 1, The Vedic Age. In the next episode, join us for the Chapter number 2, Sources of Indian History. Goodbye.